Welcome everyone to a short lecture on Heidegger on being towards death and on death more general and on the Seinsfrage, on the question of being and why it is that Heidegger focuses on death. Just as an aside, I wrote my PhD thesis on death in Heidegger, and I'm currently in touch with an academic publisher. When there's a bit of a back and forth regarding the manuscript, I'm actually at this point pondering the possibility to self-publish the book, because it would allow me to write freely what it is that I think is important, because this isn't about theory. This is about understanding what it means to be human in our epoch, more so than anything. And if you, as you know, transhumanism, for example, wants to get rid of death, wants to eradicate death, as if it were just a problem. So let me quote, for example, Harari and Kahneman, who, in a conversation which was published in 2015, you can find that online, they say that, quote, death is now optional. In the same conversation, Harari, who apparently explains to the masses what supposedly the most pressing issues of the 21st century are, well, he says that, quote, death has been relocated from the metaphysical realm to the technical realm. And I wonder who does that relocating. Is it just in the hands of the human subject, the all self-aggrandizing, all-powerful human subject that can simply take death and turn it into a technical problem waiting to be solved? Now here, this is already showing it's crude anti-human. It's anti-human. It's evil. That's an evil stance to take, to say that it's just a technical problem waiting to be solved, because it takes away something fundamentally human from the human being. So don't underestimate the evil that lurks in all of these transhumanist discourses, so-called, and how powerful they are. And then also you could wonder why it is that some bigger corporations are trying to get in on the transhumanist game. Here, death is no longer, to borrow Goethe's expression, threefold separation, not hoping ever to meet again, which speaks to the pain and helplessness humans confront when a loved one dies. Here, death is simply something to choose or not to choose from a catalogue. Is such a technological response a humane response? Or thus, this kind of a sentiment, is that already an echo of another non-human dimension? Are these ways of responding not already signs of the replacement of the human ethical with the epistemic, rational, technical, machinistic dimension? We are today suspicious of limitation, finitude, and ultimately death. Everything must be unbound. Everything is limitless. Everything is infinite. Nothing is impossible. Everything's possible, and all the possibilities, they are certainly endless, infinite. But if possibility is endless, that you know, then nothing ever truly can get actualized. Nothing can become real. It's very bad metaphysics. Let's think back to Heraclitus' word. The fragment is B20, where he says, when they are born, they accept to live and to have death. And when they give birth to children, new death is born with them. It's a quote from Heraclitus. For Heidegger, in the 20th century, we are to become mortals. We are not simply mortal because we physically die. We have to accept our mortality and death and perform that mortality to a certain degree, because without death we're nothing. We're not human without it. We don't form proper communities if we think of death as simply a problem waiting to be solved. Heidegger's notion of being towards death is probably most prominent. And he comes up with this in Being and Time. Without death, there wouldn't be something that Dasein is focused on. So death takes an extremely prominent position in Being and Time. For Heidegger, he defines Dasein's death as its own most possibility. In fact, the entire phrase is how Heidegger understands death for Dasein. Death is the own most non-relational, unsurpassable, and certain possibility of Dasein. The notion of the possible is important here. We can't get into it too much, but the German word is Möglichkeit, which means not quite possible, but translates better as saying to something is likely, something is liked. There is a certain love even in at play here that we mustn't forget, because it doesn't translate in the English. The English possibility comes from posse, which has to do with power, potence, but not so much at all with love. So there is a certain love, there's a friendship, and Heidegger mentions, and presumably he is referring to Rilke. Death for Rilke is our friend. Death is someone who lives with us, within us, dwells with us, and is a friend who we have to, whose friendship we have to cherish. And becoming an adult for Rilke means to become acquainted with death and learning how to die. The oldest truth of philosophy is learning how to die. That's a Socratic approach to philosophy that's in Heraclitus, and it makes a comeback precisely in modernity, in the modern age, a lot with Hegel, and then even more so with Heidegger, because there's never been an epoch where we would actually have to have face up to death as much as we have to now, as religion takes a bit of a backseat in the Occident. But for Heidegger, look at how he understands death. He says its own most. That's to say, it's most of my own. I come into my own only if I face up to my death. It means that I cannot pass on death. I can be replaced for anything. Anyone can take my position in any kind of a functionary position that I have. Someone else can come in and do the job. But death, no one can die my death instead of me. I cannot die anyone else's death. Everyone will have to die their own death. Hence, it's the ownmost possibility, that which comes towards us as the ownmost. It's non-relational, because there are no relations to anything else in that moment. Unsurpassable, because death is ultimately the limit against which Dasein is pushed, and against which, as it is pushed against it, it comes back to itself. It's certain, and this is a very important to notice that, because Heidegger says in an earlier lecture course, earlier than Being in Time, he points out that the cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am, by Descartes, which is one of the founding principles of this explosion that we now call modernity, postmodernity, hypermodernity, etc. The self-positing ego that is self-referential and is wants what? Certainty, certain knowledge about itself and about the world. What Heidegger says in the history of the concept of time from 1925 is, he said, this doesn't make any sense. If anything makes sense, it's sum moribundus. That means I am, because I am towards my death. That's the only certainty that we can have. That's a very radical statement. But what he wants us to say, to see, is that death isn't simply some sort of an event that's coming later on in life, that's external to us, that's got nothing to do with us. No, death is, as he says, a way of being that Dasein takes over as soon as Dasein is. And as such, the certainty of death is the only certainty Dasein truly can have. Now, being in time itself, and there will be more time as I get into the publication mode of the book, I will probably make accompanying videos for it. The question of being, die Seinsfrage, is crucial for Heidegger. That's not just for Heidegger, it's the question of philosophy. Heidegger simply has the unforgiving task to having to be the messenger in an age that has forgotten that question, which is the foundational question. Every philosopher asks that question to a certain degree. And yes, I know that Heidegger said that philosophy or metaphysics has failed to ask that question. This is what people think. But that's not the case. What Heidegger is more pointing towards is that there's a certain way of thinking of being that's been forgotten. And it's especially been forgotten in our epoch. That has to do with the history of being itself. But being in time, the title, very often it's said Heidegger wants to focus on time, and because being has to do with presence, and presence has to do with temporality, and hence what's been forgotten is time. That to a certain degree is true, but it's also a direct response to Kant and to Parmenides. Because for Parmenides sets out the foundational principle of thinking, which is being is identical with thought. And Heidegger wants to point us to, after Kant, point us to the fact that being can be thought in relationship with time and can be understood in relationship with time. But that doesn't exclude death. That doesn't push death away as a central, I would say, key to understanding the truth of being or getting an access to the question of being. I would even say that death is central. Without death as the fulcrum of the entire thought, the question of being itself can't be asked, and being itself couldn't be accessed by us. Why is that? Because death has to do with time, weirdly enough. Now, in Davos, where the now infamous Davos disputation took place, Heidegger, after the publication of Being in Time, explicitly states the following. Namely, that death is brought into play in order to account for the primacy of the horizon of the future. And I quote from Heidegger, "The analysis of death in Being in Time has the function of bringing out the radical futurity of Dasein." This is crucial. The radical futurity of Dasein, what Heidegger does post 19th century, responding to German idealism, is after the closure of metaphysics, is he responds in a way such that the future opens up again, but not in a perhaps postmodern response to it, such that the future is just a moldable, completely open virtual void that we can configure the way we please. No, the future, Zukunft, which is that which comes towards us from that which has been. The three ecstasies of temporality, that which is present, that which has been, and that which is to come, are in interplay. They cannot be separated. It is such that the original temporality that Heidegger is after is bound up in this movement. And death is the limit against which Dasein is pushed. And the other limit of Dasein, of course, is birth. So in between, Dasein is stretched out. And this being stretched out allows for the flow of the three ecstasies into one another and bursting out of one another. And by being pushed in this way towards the future, but from out of that which has been, that's how a proper openness towards an understanding of being, a horizon of meaning opens up. We exist in nihilism because we are cut off from being, from that which is old, from that which could give us meaning. We are cut off from that. You see this everywhere in the fake language that we live in. We have an absolutely ridiculous, absurdist, abstract language, that doesn't mean anything. The meta-crisis of the meta-crisis probably is the next big thing. But what we would have to do, in fact, is come back to the ground on which we've stood before and understand and see where we come from, rather than trying to make up new fancy words for something, because there is an instinct there, an instinct of reason. You could say that there is something wrong. But what's wrong is that we're being cut off from being itself, but we're also cut off, and that's en par, we're cut off from death and our mortality. We're cut off from finitude, from limitation. We want to be the boundless subject that explodes itself into the no longer a cosmos, but into the ever-expanding void that we call the universe, which has nothing unifying to it, apparently. And none of this is accidental. It's the oldest battle in the world. In the very first page of Being in Time, Heidegger quotes the old Greek word of the gigantomachia peritesousia, the gigantic battle for being, for the meaning of being. Now, time, or original temporality for Heidegger, in Being in Time, that's his major finding, if you like, is finite. Time is finite. And it's finite because it's bound up within Dasein's structures of birth and death. Those are what make them up. And if time or original temporality is finite, and by the way, this is how you get to infinite. We don't have a positive word for the infinite. Of course, we have the eternal, but philosophically speaking, the eternal does not mean an infinite amount of time that just keeps passing us by. The vulgar understanding of time is, of course, that time is t1, t2, t3, tx ad infinitum, but you couldn't make sense of yourself or anything if that is how time supposedly works. You wouldn't be able to make sense even of your surroundings, because you couldn't connect any of it. What connects all of this, what structures, as it were, the world, is ecstatic original temporality, which is finite, which is bound up by death. So the radical futurity that opens up to Dasein, which would grant a new meaning, a new way of projecting towards the future, a meaningful existence for us, a new what for, to quote Nietzsche, has to do with accepting death first and foremost, because that is what pushes Dasein back into its authentic ways of being. And authentic does not mean that I choose myself and make myself at will, ad nauseum, or just whatever I fancy at any given second. I can just be because I say so. That kind of a rampant individualism, which is no longer even an individualism because it actually is a dividualism. It's a divided self that bursts itself into the void of the universe and wants to, at the same time, weirdly enough, wants to control everything, of course, and deems itself to be the center and core of everything. We live in the Anthropocene, after all. Now, this is not what authentic means. Eigentlich means to come into one's own, not as something that I have chosen, but as that from out of which I come. That's who Dasein is. Dasein cannot escape its own being. Dasein must come back to itself, and the question of being has everything to do with that, and that's why death is extremely important, because it pushes us back to the finite possibilities of being, and it gives an horizon again. So you see world, what we call world is not the planet. World isn't just a totality of things that happen to objects that happen around us. There are no objects without a subject, by the way. And so world is something else. World is the horizon against which beings appear as meaningful to us. And meaningful, though, not just in some sort of a linguistic sense, but no, meaningful in the proper sense, that they light up in their own right and show themselves to us such as that's a proper world. Everything else is poor in world. So what we're looking at is that only when we focus or let ourselves into our own mortality, only then will a world properly arise such that meaning arises again, because then there is an horizon. What does horizon mean? It's a Greek word, of course. It means limit, border. Without a limit, without limitation, there's nothing you can find orientation towards. And to anyone who's still with me, you can see, of course, that that has everything to do with ecstatic temporality. And it takes you out from the ordinary understanding of time, which at the same time diminishes a proper understanding of being, which, because it quantifies and it fragments time, and it actually destroys this, not this flow, but this beautiful harmony of those ecstasies that are burst into one another and burst out of each other. Now, if we understood death as a technical problem waiting to be solved, then what we would do is we would take away from ourselves the possibility to gain an access again to that which is and that which has always been, to meaning itself. Without death, nihilism, without our acceptance of mortality, nihilism reigns. Nihilism is king. Everything is just a technical problem waiting to be solved in a sterile, anti-human, ultimately evil non-world. A world where machines take over, where we become beasts. And I quote a very important quote from Heidegger, from The Principle of the Ground. We dwell in proximity to death, which as the most radical possibility of existence is open to bringing what is most elevated to the clearing and lighting of being and its truth, its aletheia. Death is the as yet unthought standard of measure of the unfathomable, which means of the most elevated play in which humans are engaged in on earth, a play in which they are at stake. The unfathomable is what allows us to become human, an appreciation of the unfathomable, of death, of being, of the question for meaning, not a problem waiting to be solved for all and once and for all. Why? When you think back to Heraclitus, that new death is born with every birth, what we take away from someone who's born into a world which is no longer birth, who is born into a world where death is just a problem waiting to be solved. We're taking away their ability to be human, their ability to learn how to die. So thanks very much for listening. Subscribe to the channel and please support me on Patreon. Thank you.